Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. We're going to talk all about how to structure and organize a long-form narrative feature. And when we talk about long-form features, generally we're talking about 3,000 words plus. There's no kind of defined range. Some come in right at that 300 mark, some are, or 3,000 mark, some are 15,000, and everything in between and above. um, but the structure and organization typically isn't going to change. It does change when you kind of get into that 15,000 plus territory. But for pretty much everything I think most people are going to write when it comes to long form, today is going to have you covered. A few bits of housekeeping before we kick off here. First, if you didn't catch this already, we're going to do all of our conversing in the chat window. So if you haven't already, right down here somewhere in your Zoom frame, you'll see the chat button. Go ahead and open that up. And then when you have that open, there's the type message field at the bottom of it. Directly above that is a drop-down menu. Go ahead and change that drop-down menu to everyone. That way the whole room is going to be able to see your comments, remarks, feedback, all that stuff, questions. So we can kind of bounce ideas off one another. If you do have something that you only want to send to me, change that drop down back to hosts and panelists, and only I will be able to see it. But I hope you all brought lots of questions and comments and remarks. These are always really fun and tend to have a lot of interaction. So please don't be shy with your questions and feedback. Feel free to start dropping those in right now if you brought questions already. What else? I assume most of you found this workshop through the newsletter. If you did not, this workshop is part of a wider suite of resources we offer journalists and in particular freelance journalists, all centered around the weekly newsletter, which you can find at freelancingwithtim.com. The free version comes out every Tuesday. The paid version has an additional newsletter per week that comes out on Thursdays, and paid subscribers also get 50% off tickets to all Freelancing with Tim events, such as this one. Details are all at freelancingwithtim.com. I offer one-on-one coaching and one-on-one pitch reviews. If that is something you're interested in, you can book a session at calendly.com/Tim Herrera. And last, if you have any questions that come to mind after today's workshop, or just anything in general you want to throw out there, you can just email me. I'm just tim@freelancingwithtim.com. And that is it for me yapping. So let's get to it. I'm going to drop in the link to the story we're going to look at today. That is in the chat. And additionally, I'm going to, in the chat as well, drop in a link to my annotated version of the story. You can open that now, but don't read it quite yet, because we're going to go through in pretty granular detail about what's in there. But we'll get to that. Just have it open. We'll get to it in just a few minutes. And then there are a few other documents that I'm going to share with you, and we'll get to that when we get to that. Before we really dive in, just a few terms that we're going to use today. These are terms, they're very academic and kind of stodgy, and you're probably never really going to hear them or use them outside of this context or outside of the context where you're really in the weeds with an editor who went to journalism school, such as me. So the first is, it's kind of a two-parter. We're going to talk a lot about dramatic narrative and expositive narrative. So they're kind of this, different sides of the same coin. So dramatic narrative, whenever we talk about dramatic narrative or whenever we hear that term, think of it in terms of the action happening in the story, in the narrative of the story you're telling. So any, developments, all the characters and what they're doing, conversations, quotes, what's driving the story forward. So, you can almost kind of think of it in terms of a fiction novel. And, this is what we're going to talk about today is a technique borrowed from fiction in the 60s. So dramatic narrative, just think the action in the story, including characters, quotes, developments, all that good stuff. So on the other side, expositive narrative. So think of expositive narrative as the context that's going to help the reader better understand the kind of higher level abstract concepts, themes, and the stakes of the story. So if dramatic narrative is telling the action of the specific story and the people involved, expositive narrative is giving context and layering on more information that helps explain what we're really talking about with this story. And it's not directly related to the action of the story, but it is kind of like a cousin of the action of the story. And so you need to know both parts of that for the structure we're going to talk about today. Another term that we're going to really focus on is the cosmic graph. And so when you hear cosmic graph, and that's another very kind of traditional magazine-y term that you probably will never hear again, but it's good to know what it means. When we talk about cosmic graph, it's basically analogous to the nut graph of a news story. So when we talk about cosmic graph, just think nut graph, but cosmic graph is pretty specific to long form and magazine writing because there's a whole lot more that your cosmic graph has to do than the nut graph. And we're going to go into a whole lot of detail about that. Those are kind of the main things to know. And I'm going to I'll be dropping in links throughout to a whole bunch of stuff. And don't feel obligated to read any of them right now. Just bookmark them, write them down somewhere, come back to them when you have some downtime. But in the chat, I just put in a link to a newsletter from a couple of months ago, maybe, about just kind of a refresher on nut graphs, if you just kind of want to bone up a little bit on that. The way that we're going to structure today's workshop, I know this is a lot of throat clearing, but there's a lot to know, is we're really going to focus most of the workshop on the intro, and then we'll cover the rest of the story. There's a very specific reason for that, but just to give you kind of a heads up about what to expect out of this structurally. And last, a caveat that I always like to talk about in any workshop I do, all this is just suggestions, guidelines, and advice. There are no hard and fast rules to building a long form narrative feature. This is just a very traditional and very kind of simple structure. And once you kind of learn it through and through and understand how the components fit together, you're never going to read a magazine story the same. I promise. Like next time, after today, next time you pick up, the New Yorker or GQ or Esquire, like you're going to see the structure and it's just going to smack you in the face. I promise you that. Okay, so again, please feel free to drop in all your comments, questions, follow-ups, remarks, all that stuff. Don't be shy about that. And let's get into it. So if you go to the annotated doc that I just shared, that Google Doc, so very broadly, a simple way to think about structuring and organizing long-form narrative features is to essentially break it up into two components. And then we break it up further, but we'll get to that. So the first component is literally just the intro. And so this, depending on the length of the story and the scope of the story, this could be anywhere from 4 to 12 graphs. Depends on the story, what best serves the story, best way to tell it. But that's the first component of it. And that's what we're going to focus most of our time on today, because it's really, really important, but really difficult to do right. And then the second component is essentially everything that comes after that. And that second component, we're going to break down into two smaller components, but we'll get to that when we get to that. So we're not going to read through this entire story, but we are going to read through the intro because there's so much going on here. And there's just a ton of stuff to know. And, the reason that intros for long form are so incredibly difficult to put together is that they have so much work to do. And there's so much explaining and table setting that you need to do for the reader in the intro. So one way to think about the intro is it's basically a condensed version of the entire story. So the goal for an intro, again, using this particular structure, which works for like 75% of all long form narratives, but the goal of this intro is to explain every single thing that the reader is going to read for the rest of the story. So you're basically trying to pack in, say 5,000 words of information, knowledge, narrative, characters into, 4 to 12 graphs. Incredibly difficult to do. And then for the intro structurally, it kind of mirrors the structure of the overall story itself. So again, you're packing in a ton of information. Structurally, you're mirroring the rest of the story, and you're telescoping everything that's about to follow. So we're really going to focus a lot on the intro, and it'll become clear why we focus a little less on the second component when we get there, because that's the easiest part of this whole thing, I promise. Okay, so let's take a few minutes here, just like a minute or two, And I've labeled the paragraphs with numbers. And so we're going to go through this paragraph by paragraph. So I want you to take a second and read just the first paragraph. Read that through. I'll give you a minute. And then in the chat, just give me a thumbs up emoji when you have finished that graph. All right, let's do maybe 30 more seconds. I see a bunch of thumbs up. Okay. 10 more seconds, and then we'll get to it. Okay. So what's in that first graph? So, as I said in my email about an hour ago, we're going to focus a lot less on the specific content in here, but we're going to use the content in here as examples of structure and organization. And a lot of that is revealed just in this first graph. So first things first, the first two sentences, we're already setting a scene. So we'll take a quick aside there. A really traditional and convenient and simple way to open any story, really, but particularly for long form narrative features, a really simple and traditional way to open them is with a scene. And we're just giving away the goods right off the bat. So even in just those first two sentences, we're placed into this scene of this YouTube video, the glow of camera-friendly lighting, staring into the lens. And so that alone says a few things. The glow of camera-friendly lighting, maybe hints that these are professional video makers, they possibly make a living off this is their livelihood. And then staring into the lens, which I'm obviously doing today, but for YouTube videos, that is, there's a very specific reason that the writer chose to include that detail in here, because it signifies that they're talking directly to the audience in a way that maybe most of their videos don't. The fact that we singled that particular detail out says something, and it's a little revealing. And so, throughout, and we'll really look at this a lot in this intro, details are what make any story sing, but they're absolutely crucial for going long on a story. Think back to, you're in 5th grade language arts class and you're learning about show versus tell in writing. That's never more important than when you're putting together a long form feature. And so here, perfect example, like, she could have just said, oh, they were making a YouTube video on the couch. Certainly could have said that, but, she chose to really just show us and place us directly in that scene. The other thing, we already have two of our main characters of this story, Micah and James Stauffer. So right off we're only 2 sentences into this. I think it's like 6,000 words or so. We're only 2 sentences in, and we've already met our main characters. So, we're just kind of like establishing, doing a lot of table setting, and again, telescoping a lot of what's going to come. So moving on, 3rd sentence, but this time, instead of energetically updating the roughly 1 million subscribers, over 700,000 on Micah's YouTube and 300,000 for the family's blog, The Stauffer Life. So we can even pause there. The fact that the writer chose to say there are 1 million people who subscribe to this family, like, that's a telling detail too. Like, this is not just some rando who has a YouTube channel. Like, this is a huge, significant channel that a ton of people follow. So 1 million subscribers on their kiddos or Mika's mommy morning workout routine or vegan meal ideas. The couple had somber expressions. So even there, we're still just in the third sentence, but the writer chose to call out kiddos or mommy morning routine vegan meal ideas. Just gives you a little bit more layering and a little bit more color about who these people actually are. Like, here's like this family who makes videos about vegan meal ideas. In the back of the reader's mind, it kind of is already painting a picture like I know who these people are. And that's like, it's so subtle. And it's one of those things that, the reader may not directly and consciously realize what's going on when we use examples like that. But in the back of their mind, there's a certain image that comes to mind when you think of a family who has 1 million subscribers on YouTube and makes videos about vegan-friendly meals. Just kind of one of those very subtle, but important and really telling details. Again, details are what sell a long-form story. And then just that last little coda on the third sentence, the couple had somber expressions. So we can even pause there again. Just we're telescoping, one, what's going to happen for the rest of this single graph, but also we're establishing some context and a baseline that, like, ooh, this is probably not going to be the happiest story I've ever read. Why do they have somber expressions? So we're raising a bunch of implicit questions, which is, again, another technique that we're going to see throughout this intro in particular, raising questions that at some point we are going to answer. So here, obviously, the question is, why do they have somber expressions? And then we go directly into the quote. This is by far the hardest video James and I have ever publicly had to make, said Micah. Wearing white shirts that match the linens on the bed where they sat. Another super, like, just the minutia of this scene. Like, the writer is really putting us almost in the room with this family as they make the video. And that's like a subtle detail that really takes a seasoned writer to know to include white t-shirts that match the linens on the bed where they sat. A lazy writer could have just said, they were, filming the video in their bedroom. A lazy writer would have done that. But here we have such specific details, and it just, the image of the room, just in reading this, is already very apparent. Tiny, tiny little details. Keep that in mind as we go through. I'm going to keep calling them out because this story is one of my favorite long form narratives, and it's one that I use often in these workshops because it's so, so beautifully and artfully done, but it just has so many subtle details. Okay, wearing white shirts that matched the linens on the bed where they sat, the staffers revealed that they had placed Huxley, pause, who the hell is Huxley? Another main character that we're already introducing. Revealed that they had placed Huxley, their then almost 5-year-old autistic son from China. Okay, pause there, packing in a lot of details. Okay, it's a young child, autistic, from China. So we're already talking about adoption here, whose adoption process and life they had documented for more than 3 years with his now new forever family. Okay, we can pause there again. They're autistics who documented for more than 3 years. So that little break there, whose adoption process and life they had documented for more than 3 years. So if you haven't picked this up already, that is some very deep foreshadowing. And we're already telescoping what this entire story is about. We're like 4 or 5 sentences into the 6,000 word story, and you can probably guess everything the rest of the story is going to say. And I'm sure your guess is right if you haven't already. But see, this is why we're going to focus so much on the intro. Is we're 5 sentences in, and we already have our main characters. We have a setting. We know this is a popular family. We know it's going to cover adoption. We know who the child is. We know they have documented this child's life for 3 years on the internet. We know he was adopted from China. We know he's autistic. So we have like 100 things already in 5 sentences. And, this is really important to focus on because when you're putting together a long form narrative like this is how much information you must cram into this intro section and into each individual graph. You can't sustain even a 3,000 or 4,000 word story just on a straight sequential chronological narrative. This happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. You just can't do that. The reader loses interest. It's boring reading. And so being able to pack in all these details, have all this explanatory information, and place readers in the scene with the characters, that is so, so, so paramount. And that's in this first graph. That's really the main takeaway here is details, details, details. Put the reader in there, grab their attention, and make them feel invested in this story. Because even just now, you can think like, well, what happened to the kid? Is the kid okay? Is the kid still around? Is his family still doing things? All these implicit questions we've already raised, and we're just, the reader is just totally fascinated and invested, and we've captured their attention in here. Moving along, Mike and James tearfully explained that the extent of Huxley's needs had not been clear when they had adopted him, that it was never supposed to happen this way, and that they loved him. Again, that we could even just look at this first graph, like that's the story. That the following 5,700 words, we already know exactly what it's going to say. Okay, so we just spent like 15 minutes talking about one paragraph. Before we move on to paragraph 2, does anyone have any questions, comments, thoughts, reactions, requests for clarifications just on that first graph or anything we've talked about up until this point? Give you a quick second to think on that. Feel free to throw anything out there right now. Again, don't be shy with your questions and comments. That's why we're here. Okay. All right. Looks like we're good to go then. Okay, let's take a breath. That was a lot. There's so much going on here. Okay, so now let's look at paragraph 2. Again, I'll give you all a minute or two to read that, and then again, give me a thumbs up in the chat when you have finished. Okay, looks like we're mostly done. So there's kind of a little break here between the first and the second graphs that's worth pointing out. And this is a technique you can use in your own long form writing when you're putting together a big feature like this. And this is particular to the intro, but it carries throughout the rest of the story. And once we get to the second component of the story that I was alluding to earlier, we'll talk about the overall structure of the story, kind of what this story actually looks like. But again, the intro should mirror everything else in the story. So what we're going to talk about here in the intro is applicable to everything that follows. So why I like to take a break between the first and second graphs here. So they're very different graphs, and a lot is happening in this break. So if you look at the first graph, pure dramatic narrative, right? We're in a scene, there's action, there's quotes, there's characters, there's developments in the narrative, and it's just like straight, what's going on? Here's some things that are happening, right? But as we move into the second graph, we've already switched from dramatic narrative to expositive narrative. And readers obviously aren't even familiar with those terms and aren't expected to know that shift is happening. So you want to make it subtle and smooth, smooth those transitions. But when you're putting these together, it generally is something you do need to be very cognizant of. And so here, just, I mean, look at the first two graphs, together. Dramatic narrative versus expositive narrative. Like now that we know these terms and how they're married together, it's plain to see. So in graph 2, we have a whole bunch of things going on. One, in that very first sentence, we already have the drama and the tension of it all right there. Some people were sympathetic, some were outraged. So we already know whatever was going on with this family, it caused a firestorm on the internet. A lot of people had a lot of opinions. And so there's a lot of inherent tension and drama. So getting back to what I was saying about structure, as we go through this second graph, the stakes just get higher and higher. Okay, so in the first sentence, all right, some people are outraged, some people are a little more understanding. Second sentence, staffers lost thousands of subscribers. and Facebook and Instagram accounts sprung up demanding justice for Huxley and cancel Mike and James Stauffer. All right, so we went from some internet outrage, okay, fine, and we've ramped up the tension where they're losing subscribers, probably losing money. People are creating Instagram accounts against them, all this stuff. So the tension is just rising, okay? Moving on to the third sentence, and here we go. Brands that had worked with Micah to promote their products, including Fabletics, Suave, Danimals, and Playtex Baby, distance themselves. So again, the stakes are just rising even higher now. Whatever happened, which we still don't really know yet, is impacting their livelihood. So, the stakes just keep rising, keep rising. Moving on, they were even subject to a sheriff's office investigation after detractors suggested their other children might be endangered. So now we have law enforcement involved. We have accusations that their other children are possibly subject to some weird stuff happening. So the stakes are just getting higher and higher and higher. In the kindest light, Mika, now 33, and James, 35, were painted as well-meaning but naive parents who had gotten in over their heads. In the harshest, they were fame-hungry narcissists who had exploited a child for clicks and profit only to discard him when caring for him proved too difficult. Whew, so now we're at the highest point of the stakes. And the rising stakes here and the tension and the drama, that's really important because that is a structure that is mirrored throughout the rest of the story. And I promise we're not going to read this whole story paragraph by paragraph. That would take us an hour. But, keep that in mind, that the tension and the stakes and the drama just keep rising. And so in a little bit, when we talk about the overall structure of the entire story, you're basically going to see that structure just in the intro, because again, the intro should mirror and telescope everything that follows. And we'll talk a lot about visualizing structures. It's a very silly little practice that I like to do that we'll talk about. So just bear with me when I get there. So again, we're still fully in expositive. We're giving context. We're talking about what is happening in the orbit of this family as it relates to the drama with Huxley, but also their livelihood and their YouTube channel. And people are attacking them online, creating Instagram accounts, just trash talking them. So, we're just layering on that additional context and information that helps the reader understand what's actually going on outside of just this one video that we've talked about. So now we've expanded the scope of what the story actually is. Whereas in the first graph, we were kind of like, all right, like, okay, so there's some family making some YouTube videos, sure. But now we have the wider view of the impact this actually had. Okay, so let's move on to the third graph. Again, I will give you all just a minute or two to read that, and I'll be right back. But go ahead and read that. Give me a thumbs up when you're done. And we're back. Sorry, I just had a full-on coughing fit. I think I broke a rib, but hopefully I'm okay. Okay, so it looks like most of us are done here. Okay. So moving on to the third graph, and this is kind of the last of the intro. you'll see I pointed out some kind of natural breaks in the story. You'll see that as we kind of go through and as you look at it on your own. But so in the third graph, we're still ratcheting up the stakes, but we're still in expositive territory, okay? So we're just kind of giving more layers, more context, more information about how wide this really goes. And so we're going even a higher level. So if in the second graph, we're, so a good way to think about this is just in these three graphs, in these intro graphs, think of it in layers. So at the very base, we have that fully dramatic narrative where we're in the scene with the characters, have quotes, we can see them, we're in the room with them, all that stuff, pure dramatic narrative. Going a level up, we're shifting into expositive narrative. And here we have more context about the family, but also about the fallout and how it impacted the wider universe of what they're doing online. And we're talking about how it impacted Huxley, and we have law enforcement involved, we have angry mobs on the internet involved, all that good stuff. So finally, in the third graph, we're going even one level higher, and we're taking the widest angle, the 50,000-foot view here, where now we're not necessarily specifically talking about the Stauffers and Huxley, but we're giving a little data, some government data about adoptions in the US and how many are legally terminated in a dissolution. And even more context, 100,000 adoptions in the US are legally terminated in what's called a dissolution, making the Stauffers' decision to relinquish custody rare but not unheard of. So let's kind of hang on that sentence for a second, because what that's doing there is, again, we're giving numbers to this, and this story isn't inherently a data story, but it does add a little bit more useful information for the reader to understand the context in which this story is playing out. The writer is telling us, this is the most common thing, but it does happen. So, that kind of is another layer that, like, this isn't just this one particular family that went through this, terrible ordeal. 100,000 families in the US go through this as well per year. So, suffers to relinquish custody, rare but not unheard of. Last, had they not shared Huxley's adoption with the world, building an audience from videos about everything from his medical diagnoses to his food anxiety, they would be dealing with a private family tragedy rather than a public scandal. Again, a lot going on there, and we're going to hold on to that, whatever thoughts you have about that, because we're going to come back to that in like 2 minutes. Finally, instead, the Stauffers have been held up as examples of what is wrong with both influencer and adoption culture and what can happen when a child is caught at the intersection. So that very last line of the third graph, which is the last line of the intro, kind of says it all. And you can guess that, okay, so that's really what this story is about. So, we've been talking for half an hour about 3 paragraphs, but truly, I can't stress this enough. Like, that is how important your intro is. There's just so much you have to really pack in so densely, and you have to really establish context and, like I said, do a lot of table setting for the reader. You want to make them feel engrossed in the story, but really invested, and give them some guideposts. And that's what we've done in these first 3 graphs. We've, like, everything that you're going to read for the rest of the story, you've already read. You know exactly what's going to happen. It's just, what is the actual story here? And that's how important the intro is. Now, there's a couple of things that we're going to hang on for the intro here. First, come back to the structure. So there's an exercise that I did learn in J school. It's very dorky, very nerdy. But when you're analyzing a long form feature and really diving into it as like an educational exercise, what you can do is literally get out a piece of paper and a pencil and draw the structure of the story. And I know that sounds extremely silly, and it is, but it really forces you to think about structure in a less linear way. Okay, so, God, I can remember, just for example of how silly this can be, but truly and genuinely useful. There was one assignment where, so we would go through the class and everybody would draw one particular log form feature, and then we'd have to like draw it on the whiteboard, and everybody would discuss it and all that. But I couldn't even remember which story I had. But I got up to the whiteboard, and my illustration of the structure of the story was a beach with crashing waves, with palm trees, with turtles, with like people in beach chairs and towels and swimwear, all that kind of stuff, which I know sounds very weird and silly. But, thinking through the structure of a story visually can kind of make things just seem a little clearer as you're piecing them together on the page. So for this, to really, really take that down into a little bit more less silly terms, the way that you can structure this, just these first three graphs, is basically the traditional way that we all learn to visualize narratives when we're in middle school or high school, and that's just starting at the intro, and tension, drama, developments, narrative just keeps escalating till it reaches the peak, and then there's the denouement, the aftermath, what happened to all the people involved, what came after the events resolved themselves, however they resolved themselves. And so if you look at this intro, these three graphs, in those terms, we basically have that exact same structure. Tension escalating, drama escalating, we're learning more about it, we're getting more context. The only part we're missing of that traditional narrative structure is we've hit the peak, but we don't have the denouement. Because in the intro, the writer has left us there kind of hanging at the peak. Like we're at full 100% drama and tension mode, but we don't know where it goes from here. We can probably guess a little bit, but not really. And that's the sweet spot. You're almost kind of like teasing the reader, putting a little cliffhanger in there to keep them reading. I had this professor who would always talk about, the primary objective of any sentence in a story is to get the reader to the next sentence. Sounds, again, very silly, but wonderful advice and something we should all think about whenever we're writing anything. But, particularly when we're putting together long form features, because if we're going to expect a reader to get through 6,000 words, it's kind of on us to make sure that they get to that next sentence, and then the next sentence, and then the next sentence, and so on. But so we're kind of applying that idea to the structure of the intro, because we've gotten them up here, we're at peak drama, tension, all that. But what happens now? So it's a little bit of a cliffhanger. And the last bit on the structure of the intro, I don't expect any of you to have fully read the story yet, but do read it. I mean, it's a fascinating story. It's one of my favorite long-term features of the last few years. It's the reason I love to focus on it so much. But so read it. But as you read it, you'll see that the structure of the rest of the story, again, that second component that I mentioned earlier, very closely mirrors the structure of the intro. Again, just think of the traditional narrative structure: escalating tension, peak drama, denouement. And again, in the intro, we left out the denouement because we wanted to leave the reader with a cliffhanger. And so, try to, I mentioned this in my email when I sent out the story, as you're reading through this, really focus less on the individual components of this particular narrative, but rather note why certain things are in a certain place and really take note of the detail, and try to kind of reverse engineer and put yourself in this writer's shoes, and try to figure out why she chose to put this sentence here, that sentence there, this graph here, why it led into this graph. And, the intro really speaks to the rest of the story, but it's a good way to do that because it's only three graphs, so it's a little easier than going through a 6,000 word story. But, that's exactly what we're trying to do here. Really think, and, do this for every feature you read. And I promise you, are going to see this structure everywhere you look now. But, really just think through, and as you're putting your own stories together, it does take that much planning in terms of structure and organization. But if you can keep in mind, the intro, everything else, and then within that, structure in the intro, and then structure of everything else, those two structures should mirror each other. And generally speaking, they should follow the traditional narrative shape. Won't always. Again, this is one of many ways to write a long form feature, but it is the most traditional and the simplest. And to whatever degree that you can take out as much process and thinking when you're putting together a big story like this, all the better. So once you know the structure and have the structure down pat, you can really focus on the content of it rather than how you're going to organize it, which only helps. All right. Before we do this, there's one more super significant thing in the intro that we're going to talk about. But before we get there, let's pause. What questions do you have on what we've gone over so far? I know I've thrown out 100 things at you, so let's take a breath. What questions, comments, reactions, requests for clarifications do you have? No one has a single question. Wow. Okay. Great. Well, I guess this is just a brilliant set of folks here. Wonderful. Okay. So last big bit on the intro. And we're going to take a few steps back here. So when you're thinking about and reporting out a long form feature, long form narrative feature, one of the most crucial things you need to keep in mind is that you absolutely must have a handful of themes, of abstract concepts, of big picture ideas in mind that are going to carry this story throughout. Those themes and ideas and concepts, think of that as the foundation of your story that everything else rests on. And we're going to do a quick little participation exercise. I promise it's the only one we do. But think through, we're going to take a few minutes here and go back and kind of just skim through the first 3 paragraphs again and see if you can identify the themes, the abstract ideas, the big picture concepts contained in these first 3 graphs. And again, they're going to come up again and again throughout the rest of the story, the following 5,500 words, but they're the themes that the entire story rests on. And so another way to think about this is the themes, ideas, and concepts, that's what we're actually talking about. That's the point of this story. That's what the writer is trying to convey and get across, almost kind of like a discourse about these huge, huge, high-level abstract themes. And the narrative, the specifics of the action, the drama, the tension of the people and events we're actually following in the dramatic narrative, that's just kind of the vehicle through which we're talking about these themes and ideas. And that's, again, that's the most traditional way to put together a long form feature. And something that I'd kind of mentioned earlier is it's basically impossible to go this long on any story without having those themes. Because then again, you're just telling kind of a very straightforward chronological, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, and then. And, we've all read stories like that. Some of us have probably written stories like that. I certainly have. And they're fine. But when you get into that, 3, 4, 5, 6,000 word and above length, you really can't do that anymore. So you need those themes and ideas and concepts. So take a few minutes here and see if you can pull out a handful of themes, ideas, and concepts, very high level, very abstract, very big picture, that jump out to you. And then put those in the chat. And we're going to come back to them. I have my own set, but I want to know what themes, ideas, and concepts are jumping out to you at a high level. So read through again, just take a skim, and then drop all your themes into the chat. I'll give you a few minutes for this one. Wendy, good call. What else? What else are you guys seeing in here? Consequences of internet fame. Good. Issues family face with the reality of the adoption process. Good, good, good. Modern celebrity and the dark sides of influencer culture. Very good. Inner lives of influencers, troubled adoptions, privilege, internet pylons, the personal made public. Good, Mitra. Discrepancy between public posts and private trauma. Ooh, haven't heard it worded that way. That's good. I like that, Rachel. Family, social media culture, influencer culture, adoption. Can kids be used to earn family income? What? Oh, Emma, you got the one people usually miss. White saviorism, celebrity culture and wealth. Tara, influencer culture, performance as commodified identity. Commodified identity is performance, race, perception, race. Yep, Terry, you got it too. Exploitation, extreme wealth, late capitalism. That's Elena, that's not one I see often. It comes up every so often. That's good though. I love when that one comes up. Agreed, also. How influencers use their kids and make life choices to make money. Yes, very good. What else? What else? There's a couple that always stick out to me that maybe somebody else is seeing. There's a big one that I don't think anybody has mentioned yet. Yeah, nobody's caught this one yet. It's huge, and it plays a significant part of the rest of the story. It's one of the core. These are all core themes, but this one is paramount. Wendy, you're getting there. Rachel, how sponsors are paying attention to what influencers do. Emma, you're 2 out of 2. All right. Okay, this is great. Wow, you guys have what? I mean, to be totally frank, these are some of the better answers that I've got. I do this workshop a lot, and these are exceptional answers, all of you. Yeah, you all really kind of nailed it. Yeah, you basically pulled out most of the things that I always like to talk about. So the ones, as a group, we've covered everything that I usually pull out of this. Most of you pulled this one out. Privacy of children online. Can they consent? Is it exploitation? What are the morals of exploiting your child who cannot consent to make money and gain internet fame? Online fame in general, what it means to have it, what it means to lose it. And a few of you called out, what happens when the masses turn against you. That's a real big one. And that really plays into, and a bunch of you mentioned this one, influencer culture. I didn't see this specifically, but another thing that does come out throughout the whole story and another core theme is influencer culture, but a specific subset of influencer culture, parents and kids and the family YouTube channel. That's a real big one that pops up all throughout the story. Excuse me. This is the one that I was looking for. Emma called this one out. Complications of the adoption process when it comes to disabilities. There was only, I think, one line in the intro about that, but it is huge. Let's see, the line was, actually, maybe there were two. So in the first graph, staffers revealed that they had placed Huxley, their then almost 5-year-old autistic son from China. There's two things from there we'll pull out, but autistic. And then the other one was, in the kindest light, the parents are painted as well-meaning but naive parents who had gotten in over their heads. So this one's a little more subtle, but it's one that pops up all throughout the story, and it really is a core theme. So that's, again, another thing to keep in mind. Another thing that a few of you did mention as well, getting involved in things that you may not be ready for and may not be able to handle the consequences thereof. Huge one. Honestly, that's barely even a theme. That's just like exactly what the story is on its face. But it's something we come back to again and again. And then the last one that a few of you caught, white savior complex, white people adopting a Chinese child, coming in to save everything. That one, I've spoken with the writer of this. I've had her on a few workshops, and that was not something that she really intentionally or deliberately put in. It's just so implicit in the way that this played out that it's kind of unavoidable. And sometimes as you're reporting out a story, and this is kind of a broader takeaway from this, as you're reporting out the story, the themes will emerge and present themselves. You never want to go into a story with a preconceived notion of what you think the themes are. don't go in with themes. Themes will reveal themselves the more people you talk to, the more you learn about a given situation, the more reporting you do around whatever your story is. That's when you start to begin to pull out the themes in your own reporting. And it's not easy. That's one of those times where, after you've done a ton of reporting, you're kind of taking a little breather on your reporting out this, 6,000 word story. That's when you kind of take a very big step back and look at what you have so far and try to find the connective tissues between certain ideas and see if there is a theme there. And again, most of the time, those themes will present themselves to you. You generally don't have to go searching super, super hard. I mean, you do have to really go searching. It's not easy, but they become obvious the deeper into a story you get. And just to reiterate something that I had said a little bit ago, you can't write 6,000 words without having those themes. You don't need to, and one of the other things, none of these are explicitly expressed in the copy. The writer didn't say the themes of my story are blah, 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 blah. Like, you don't need to do that. They should be implicit. And they should all be in the, every single theme of this story, every one that you pulled out, the ones that I had mentioned, all of those are implicitly in the intro. And the intro is where you express those themes. And a lot of time that's going to come through in your cosmic graph, which in here, the third, but yeah, and I should have clarified this earlier. When we say cosmic graph, it's kind of the same as nut graph in that it doesn't strictly mean one single paragraph. And for long form features like this, generally it's not going to be just one paragraph because there's so much information that you need to pack in there. So by cosmic graph, don't think one single paragraph, think one or more paragraphs. But so for this one, the cosmic graph is really kind of half of paragraph 2 and all of paragraph 3. I would consider that the cosmic graph of this story. And a lot of the time, that's where you can implicitly layer in your themes and your abstract ideas and high-level concepts. And again, these were just themes specific to this story. As you're reporting out your own long-form narratives, again, the themes will emerge and present themselves. And that's where when you're putting together the intro, have the themes in the back of your mind. Maybe, write them down somewhere. Have a separate Google Doc, like these are the themes and why of your story, and then figure out ways to, delicately and artfully imply those themes in the intro. And I know I keep saying this, but the reason I use this story so frequently for these types of workshops is the writer just does such a beautiful job of saying so much without ever saying it. And that is just like that's what you want to do with your long form narratives. And this, this story in particular is so worth studying in such details. I mean, we've been talking for an hour and we've gone through 3 paragraphs. But that's going to be the hardest part. That's the hardest part of any long form feature. And we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about the rest of the story. I promise it's much simpler. And once you learn that, everything else just kind of falls into place. But, the reason we focus so much on the intro is it's the hardest part, content wise, but also structurally and thematically. So, really that's where a lot, not the bulk of your time, but a significant amount of your time when you're structuring and organizing your reporting, a significant time and effort is going to be devoted to your intro. Oh my goodness, that's a lot, right? Let's see, we had a few late additions here for themes. Yeah, stability, authenticity, morality of private family live when it's performative. Perfect. Emily Waugh, perfect. Yeah, sponsors are paying attention. Not all people who can be parents should be parents. Ableism, cancel culture, rehoming kids has been covered sporadically over the years. Yeah. Okay, so that's it for the intro. It only took us 45 minutes to get through it. We'll take another quick pause. I want to give you the opportunity to ask any questions about anything we've talked about so far. I promise the rest of this is much simpler, and once you kind of get a grip on it, everything kind of falls into place. And so there are only a couple of major things that we'll talk about, but once you learn them, you're in pretty good shape. But now, questions about the intro, questions about anything we've discussed so far, anything in general, any questions about long forms at all? I'll give you a second to pop those in. I'm going to try to get a little throat refresh real quick. Anna asks, if you had to swap the third paragraph for something else, what else could have been there instead of the data? Is there any other part, maybe a graph that already exists, that could have gone there? I mean, it's an interesting question. I haven't ever had that question when I talk about long form stuff. I don't know, I'm hesitant to like change anything in the story because I think it's almost perfect. But one thing I will say concretely is that you need that data in there because it really does give a lot clearer context about how I was going to say how widespread this is, but it's not really that widespread. But it is a thing that happens, and it's not terribly, terribly unique. And so this family is going through something that many, many families every year go through. So, on the one hand, you definitely need that data. But, there is a lot in that third graph. I, I far be it from me to edit what I consider a near perfect piece, but I could maybe in that third graph see a little bit more, maybe a little bit more kind of like teasing about what's to come, because I know what's to come, and so I know there's like a little bit further we could have gone there, and so I would have just dropped in a couple more little nuggets about the fallout, because we maybe to a slightly higher degree than I would have done if I were editing this, we did leave the readers with a pretty big cliffhanger here. And we walk right up to the line of it being too much a cliffhanger where it gets confusing. We're on the right side of that line still, but right there. And so I may have just clarified a little bit more and just kind of hinted a little more clearly about what's going to come. But there's not a lot I would have changed about that third graph otherwise. Does that answer your question? I'm not sure if that's totally what you're asking, but that's how I would have approached it if I were editing this. And again, this is a near perfect story. Tara asks, I'm interested in how the intro did not give context of prior family YouTube scandals. I would have been tempted to do that, then unnecessarily try to distinguish the story from those previous stories. And secondly, I read the white on white linen observation as a subtext for race. Did you? Whoa! All right, let's go backward on this comment. No. I think I think the details imply that this is probably a white family, but that line in particular never struck out to me as a subtext for race, but I don't know, you might be onto something there. I've never gotten that comment for the dozens of times I've workshopped this particular story. Tara, good call. Yeah, I never put that together. That's very smart. Oh, and Michaela weighs in white on white to be about Christian purity. Yeah, good point. Wow, yeah, maybe I need to think a little more on that. This is something that hadn't totally jumped out at me before. That's very good. Oh yeah, S.E. Vaughn, I saw the white on white as a visual for clean, straight, and yes, purity. Yeah. I think you're all right. I do. Those are really astute observations. Well done. Wow, this is a good crowd. Good work. And then Tara, I know you had a different part of your question. Interested in how the intro did not give context to prior family YouTube scandals. I would have been tempted to do that, then unnecessarily try to distinguish the story from those previous stories. Yeah, I've gotten that comment before too, and I think the writer made, there's as we get deeper into the story, the writer kind of touches on that, but I'm guessing, and this isn't a question that I asked Caitlin specifically when I had her on. Caitlin's the writer of the story, about her thought process when it came to placing this particular controversy in the context of other YouTube family controversies that have happened. But my guess would be, and this is purely a guess, and the way that I read this as an editor, if I were editing the story, it would be it would be a really slippery slope to accidentally fall into the area where you're kind of distracting from the central themes of this story, and you're almost veering into, I don't want to say trend story territory, but you're kind of losing the thread a little bit when you bring in all these other controversies. The writer does that in bits and pieces here and there, but I think really presenting this particular situation in contrast to all the other, and take your pick of the thousands that have happened, but all the other controversies around YouTube families, I think it would kind of fuzzy up the picture a little bit. And I think it would divert the focus in a way that wouldn't best serve this particular story. That's my guess of why the writer didn't go that route. and that's how I would have edited the story if it had come in as a comparison type or a trend type story. But again, there are slices of that throughout. But I think they chose the right balance of kind of focusing outward versus staying with this one particular controversy. Good observation, though. That's a really good observation. Nino, do you have a rule? How much can you hop around in your timeline? There's no rule. The only rule is hop around in a way that best serves the story and tells the best story. You can read long form narratives that jump around in 3 or 4 different time periods and completely pulls it off seamlessly. We've also all seen that fall flat. But there's no rule, whatever. It's funny. Yesterday, I was literally editing in a one-on-one for a freelancer, a long form narrative feature, kind of similar to this, where the writer was trying to, and they'd be fun with me talking about this. We talked about it. The writer was trying to weave together a few different timelines because there were, it's very complicated, but the super, super simplified version is there were significant events that were germane to the overarching narrative arc of the story that happened in different time periods. And that's not a problem. That can be a feature, feature, not a bug type thing, can be a feature of the story that can really be additive. But the writer kind of got lost in the weeds a little bit in a way that it wasn't totally clear when time shifts were happening. And so I got like, I don't know, a third way through it. The story was like, I don't know, 5,000 words or so. I got like a third way through and I literally said like, I don't know where I am and I don't know when I am. So you really just, when you are doing time jumps, and this is separate from jumping between dramatic narrative and expositive narrative, which we'll talk about. But specifically when you're doing time jumps and moving through different time periods, you do need to be a little bit more clear and explicit, not in a way that hits the reader over the head, but you want to make sure they're not getting lost in some weird like Marvel-style time travel adventure where nobody knows when the hell they are. It's very tricky, but when done right, it's beautiful writing. Okay. Okay, Anna, great. Yeah, why don't I parody? Why don't I visualize some of the rational thing? Yeah, okay, perfect. Okay, so we have about 15, 20 minutes left. Gather up all your questions. We'll save a few minutes at the end to talk about any questions on stuff we haven't covered. Again, the rest of this is going to be very simple, much easier than everything we've talked about so far. But I'm going to share with you the outline of the story. And again, it's all about structure and organization today. So open up that. Oh, excuse me. I'm so sorry. I feel like I can't even talk today. Open up that doc. And in that doc, I put the graph number, word count, and then I go into what I keep referring to without actually talking about it, the back and forth between dramatic narrative and expositive narrative. And so there's a bunch of like numbers in here. We have, so we're done with the intro. So remember I said, think about a long form narrative in terms of 2 components. The first component being the intro. We're done with that. We're not going to talk about the intro anymore, except for a little bit when we're doing a comparison. But by and large, we're done with the intro. So the second component, everything else in the story, the obvious bulk of the story, we only talk about 3 graphs of, what did I say, a 58 graph story. Everything else structurally and organizationally just falls into place in a very simple way that, again, takes out a lot of the thinking that you have to do when you're trying to organize and structure your own long-form narratives. And so what we're talking about here, and I'm going to send you a link to, perfect timing, the Harvard's Nieman Lab, which, if you're not familiar, is kind of part think tank, part educational resource for journalists based out of Harvard. Couldn't have asked for better timing, but just like this month, this is from April, but very recently they've been running a series on long form structure, but mostly reporting and interviewing. And there are a couple of others that I'll share just because it's good information. And we didn't talk about reporting today, which, obviously you can't do this without doing good reporting. But you don't have to read that yet, but it goes into a little bit more detail about what I'm about to tell you. So second component of our story, everything else, the remaining 55 graphs of this story, structurally and organizationally, there's basically only one trick we're playing here, and that is flip-flopping back and forth between dramatic narrative and expositive narrative. That's it. That's one of only two structural techniques you need to know when you're filling out the everything else of your story after the intro. Like, that's literally it. It actually is that simple. And I promise you, we're going to see this so much in every long form story you read for the rest of your life. And that's it. It really is that simple. So I'll talk about the second technique in a minute. But when it comes to switching back and forth between dramatic narrative and expositive narrative, we call this braided writing. And that's exactly what that Neiman story I just shared with you focuses on. Come back to it whenever you just bookmark it, read it when you have a little downtime. But so braided writing is, kind of exactly what it sounds like. We're weaving together two different styles of writing in ideally a seamless and organic and very natural way. And so, excuse me, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I'm usually not this choked up. So when it comes to braided writing for long form narratives, generally speaking, when we talk about braided writing, we mean weaving together dramatic narrative and expositive narrative. And so you can almost think of it, if you really want to get very literal about this, and this is actually something I do, when I'm trying to employ braided writing in something I'm writing or that I'm editing even too. And, as a quick aside, braided writing isn't exclusive to long form narrative features. It can be used in pretty much anything. And a lot of stories will benefit from that type of structure. You see a lot in personal essays too, but it's extremely common and very traditional in long form narrative features. But if you want to be super literal about it, and this is something that I have done and I've coached writers to do, is always keeping in the back of your mind that you're writing one cohesive whole, but you can almost either mentally or literally break the story up into two separate components and basically write them out individually. And then after those two components are done, weave them together with seamless transitions that hide your seams. And so, the first version of their story is going to be you're just only writing the dramatic narrative, the action, the developments, the characters, the quotes, the driving forces of this story. That's all your dramatic narrative. Just write it through. And again, most, I wouldn't say most, but it's something I like to do because it works for me and helps me clarify my thinking. It's not for everyone because it's not the easiest exercise to do, but it really does at least do it once in your, in the next couple of years when you're putting together a long form, if only just to help you visualize the structure that we're talking about here. And again, it's very simple. We're just going back and forth. But anyway, this exercise, write through just the dramatic narrative, like have in the back of your mind all the expositive narrative stuff. And, as you're writing the dramatic, like take breaks and make notes when you think of something you definitely want to include, or you already have the reporting ideally mostly done. But so write through the dramatic side. And then when you're finished with that, go back and write through the expositive side. And this is a tricky exercise to do. And it does take a lot of time and effort because as you're writing both through separately, you still need to keep in mind where the natural and organic breaks, generally in the dramatic narrative side, are. And in those breaks is where you're going to insert the expositive narrative. And then when you're writing the expositive side, you need to think, you kind of think about it in chunks. And you need to figure out where those chunks are going to fit into the dramatic narrative. And then once you kind of have at least a sketch of both sides, that's when you start to meld them, combine them, pop in those chunks of expositive into the dramatic narrative, and then start to tie it all together with seamless transitions and organic transitions. Again, that's a very literal interpretation of braided writing and a very literal way of structuring a story and separating it out between dramatic and expositive. But it's elucidating, and it can really help you just visualize what your story actually is outside of the content of the words you're actually putting in there. Because all we're talking about is just structure here. But once you kind of get a hang of that and really understand how it works and how these two sides of the same coin need to meld together, once you have a good handle on that, you don't really need to think about structure anymore. Like, that's taken care of. Once you have the story and you're set on, I want to use this very traditional structure for my long form feature for this one, you already have your structure, so you don't need to think about that anymore. So you can solely focus on the reporting, on making your writing truly sing, on pulling out those, tiny details and planting them in the story so the reader feels like they are there with your characters. They're watching the developments of the story happen. They're watching the action. They're with the characters. And again, I keep saying this, but it really is that simple. Like, just have that structure in mind, and the rest of it kind of falls into place like a puzzle. And that's it. Like, that is the grand secret of long form writing. That's it, and some writers are, some writers, and I've worked with writers like this, they do that without really thinking about it, because it is such a traditional way of doing any type of journalistic writing in general. This is just to reiterate, this is not a structure that you only see in long form narrative features. It is one that I would say is probably overrepresented in long form narrative features because it works so well when you're going long on a story. But you can see this in an 800 word daily, or a 1500 word third day feature. This type of structure is everywhere in journalistic writing. But if you are going to start writing long form narrative features, it's a structure you really need to get comfortable with and learn how to do well. Because again, it takes a lot of thinking away, but it serves most, I would say the majority of long form features best. And to come back to something I said way back when, an hour and a half ago, this is not the only way to write a long form narrative feature. There's 1,000 ways to write every different story, 1,000 different ways to write every story. Again, this is just the most traditional and the simplest, in most cases, not all, the one that is best going to serve your story. And that's really the only rule when it comes to long form narrative feature writing, is this: the best structure for your story is the structure that best serves your story. So I had mentioned in the second component, the everything after the intro part of your long form story. The other technique, the other strategy you need to know, is just keep in mind the shape of the narrative arc of your story. And if you can remember, we talked about this for the intro, because the intro went like this: rising tension, rising action. And then we kind of left the readers up here without giving them the denouement. But as you're putting together this second component, the everything else of your story, on top of weaving together dramatic and expositive narratives, try to kind of map it on that same rising structure where the tension's escalating, the action is getting more dramatic, the stakes are higher, and they just keep going up until you do reach the apex of that line. And that's, the peak, the defining moment or action or conversation sometimes of the entire story. That's your highest point of dramatic intensity. And that's going to be the peak. And then after that, depending on the story, could be a few graphs, could be 10 or 15 graphs. That's the denouement, where you talk about the fallout, what happened to everybody involved, what happened to the situation, anything in the orbit of your story. Just tie up all the loose ends and just kind of wrap everything up in a little nice bow for your reader, so that you've answered all of the implicit questions that you've raised, and they're not left wanting of any question or thought that you maybe raised early in the story that just didn't pay off. You want to make sure you pay those off. And we didn't look at this. So if you want to switch back to the annotated version of the story, everything that I just mentioned, and we don't have to go through it now, you can go through that on your own time, because it'll just reflect everything that I just told you. But in the annotated version of the story, the first link that I'd sent you, I mark out where the story shifts from dramatic to expositive and vice versa. I put blocks in every shift, so you'll be able to see that. But again, the more comfortable you get with this type of structure, you're just going to see that naturally. And a lot of the times, magazines are design-wise are pretty good about breaking it up anyway. So you'll see, big paragraph breaks at organic breaking points in the story. And so there's kind of a visual cue. I'm talking mostly about when you're reading a print magazine, but there's a lot of that in online presentations too. So a lot of the times, the publication is telling you, okay, here's the break. But even without those, once you get comfortable with this structure, you're just going to see them. They're going to slap you in the face when you see that shift. And you're going to think back, oh, that's what Tim was talking about. I promise you. But so go through, and again, you don't necessarily have to read every word of the story, but do take note of the overall structure in the second half of it, the final 55 graphs, but specifically look at when the shift happens between dramatic and expositive. And in the document that I shared with you called Story Outline, I even note there are, in the second component of the story, there are 4 sections of expositive narrative, 5 sections of dramatic narrative. And again, they are noted in the full annotated version of the story. And then these are just kind of notes for you to reference, but we've talked about all of this. This is just kind of to keep handy to reference. I kind of wrote out just a little sliver of what the structure looks like, the arc of the story. Intro scene, as we've discussed at length, the cosmic graph, which is like a graph and a half in 2 and 3. Then from there, everything else, it's either dramatic narrative or expositive narrative, and then we're flipping back and forth. And then in here, I also put right below that, if you're looking at the document called Story Outline, you'll see how I broke the switches up. So first escalation, graph 17, we're in dramatic, then we're in expositive, back to dramatic, the big reveal in graph 27, which is, kind of some of the central tension. Back to expositive, then dramatic, the confession, and these are kind of specific to the content of the story, but the structure speaks for itself. And then finally, dramatic narrative, the aftermath, which is graph 50 through 58. There's the denouement. There's the where are they now kind of type thing. And then there's just more notes on all that. Some specific techniques that the writer employed. So there I just kind of call out some buildup, the reveal, some foreshadowing, some aftermath, all that stuff. But, again, as long as you are following that traditional narrative shape that we all learned in middle school and high school, this is all going to be very explicit, and you'll be able to see that on its own. And then the last thing that I'm going to share with you, and this is just kind of like, oh, okay, interesting to have. This is just the character list of the story. I just put that in the chat. And so that's just who's in the story, who's quoted in the story, kind of what did they do, who are they, what did they add. I think if I remember right, there's only one anonymous source in here, but the reason that I'm sorry, these are just the quoted sources. But the reason I put that in there is just to give you a sense of how many people this writer talked to. But as you're looking through the character list, keep in mind, these are just the people the writer quoted. There's probably at least that many individuals and probably more with whom the writer spoke, but just never ended up quoting. It was either for context for her to help her shape her thinking around the story, just information that she needed, just background information, just more detail and color without quoting the person. So again, these are just the quoted characters. Hidden is the 15 to 20 more individual people the writer spoke with to put this story together, just to give you kind of a general sense of how much reporting really goes into a story like this. Oh my goodness. Okay. That's it. That's all I have. We'll take a few minutes. Please drop in any questions, comments, thoughts, or anything else in the chat. Oh, Asia, I see that you need the link to the story. I'm just going to put in, I'm going to, so I should have said this earlier, but I will send the playback for this tomorrow. And in that, I will include all of the links and stories that I referenced, including the documents here. So if you didn't grab them, totally fine. Everything will be in the email tomorrow with the playback. So if you didn't grab them, don't worry about it. And that'll be sometime tomorrow. Okay, so questions, comments, thoughts, reactions, requests for clarification, anything else. We have a couple of minutes left. If you have any final thoughts or last questions that you want to get in here, either about anything we talked about or anything we didn't talk about. Let's see. Tips, resources for developing feature pitches. It's basically the same as you develop any pitch, just longer with a little bit more detail. I have been kicking around the idea of doing like a specifically long form feature pitch type thing, newsletter, workshop, something. So I will let this group in particular know if and when that ends up happening. Okay, well, listen, thank you all so much for joining today. This is a truly excellent group. You all had amazing insights and comments and questions. I really appreciate you spending an hour and a half of your Wednesday with me. Again, my email is tim@freelancingwithtim.com. If you have any questions or thoughts that come up later that we didn't get to today, I'm very around. And otherwise, thank you again so much for joining today. I really, really appreciate it. Keep an eye on your inbox tomorrow for the playback and the links. And otherwise, I hope you all just have a wonderful rest of the week. Take care.